He never said, "I love you," the way I expected, not with urgency, not with emphasis, not with a grand pause that left the room holding its breath. In fact, he didn't say it at all, not for weeks, then months. And I remember waiting, quietly, wondering if silence meant absence. If not saying it meant he didn't feel it. I watched for signs, tested waters, leaned into moments where the words could have lived, but they never came. What came instead was something else entirely: presence. Attention, stillness. He never promised forever, never told me I was the one. And it unsettled me. I'd been trained to look for declarations, those sweeping, cinematic lines that anchor a relationship, but he never gave me those. He gave me morning coffees made exactly how I liked them. He gave me space to think even when I withdrew. He gave me eye contact that didn't flinch even when I was emotional. He never said what I thought I needed to hear. But what he did, the quiet things, spoke in a language deeper than sound. I remember one night, lying next to him in silence. I was on the verge of asking, "What are we?" just to make the ambiguity stop echoing in my head. But I didn't. I stayed still. And in that stillness, I felt his hand find mine, no urgency, no performance, just presence. He didn't say we were anything, but in that small gesture, I felt everything I had been reaching for: safety, certainty, connection. That was the night I realized some people don't express with words. They express through what they choose to remain for. It took time to trust what wasn't said. In the beginning, I mistook his quiet for hesitation. I thought if he really felt it, wouldn't he say it? But then I watched how he moved when I wasn't looking. The way he made sure my doors were locked. The way he listened fully without interrupting. The way he respected my silence without trying to fix it. There were no confessions, no poetic outbursts, but there was consistency. And that, I realized, is its own kind of language, spoken not from the mouth, but from the soul. What I used to crave were words, proof, labels. But what I got was something harder: to deny action without performance, love without spectacle. He never said, "You're mine," but I never felt more chosen. He never said, "I miss you," but I always knew when he did, through the way he noticed the smallest changes in my mood, the way his eyes paused on me a little longer after time apart. And maybe that's the thing I hadn't been taught: real love doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it barely speaks at all. But it never stops being heard. There were times I wanted to shake the words out of him, not out of anger, but longing. I wanted to hear it, to hold on to syllables like anchors. But every time I came close to asking, something stopped me. Not fear, but awareness. I began to understand that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was intention. He didn't say things unless he meant them. He didn't use language to fill space. And once I stopped trying to force sound, I started hearing the truth behind it, subtle, solid, and consistent. Once, I got sick and didn't tell him. I wanted to see if he'd notice. I wanted proof of intuition, of connection. And sure enough, he called, not to pry, not to press, just to say, "You okay today?" That was all. No drama. But in that moment, I felt more seen than I ever had with men who constantly said the right thing but never actually paid attention. He never claimed to read my mind, but somehow he always read my energy, and his response came not in romantic phrases, but in quiet presence. His love didn't arrive wrapped in compliments. He didn't feed me words daily, but when he looked at me, I felt spoken to, not in sentences, but in steadiness. In the way his energy settled when I entered the room, in the way his eyes didn't dart, didn't search, they landed. That gaze said, "I'm here. I see you, you're enough." He didn't have to say it aloud. His body said it. His rhythm said it. And I started realizing some people don't express love verbally because their entire existence is the expression. I remember crying once quietly, trying not to show it. He didn't rush in with questions or clicks. He just sat beside me, put a glass of water on the table, stayed close, didn't interrupt the moment with noise. That silence used to scare me. It felt like distance, but in that instance, it felt like safety. He didn't need to fix it. He trusted me to feel it. And that trust said more than any "it's going to be okay" ever could. He didn't speak to comfort, he embodied comfort, without asking for recognition. In his world, words were tools, not currency. He didn't spend them carelessly. And because of that, when he did speak, when he finally said something soft, rare and true, it landed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken moments. I began to treasure his silence, not fear it. I stopped trying to decode him, and instead started watching, listening. letting the space between us be what it was, honest, quiet, sacred. And in that space, I discovered a truth I never saw coming. Love doesn't need to echo. It just needs to stay. The world taught me that love should sound like poetry, loud, certain, often repeated. But with him, love sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like dishes done without asking, like the door quietly locked behind me when I forgot, like the steady rhythm of his breathing when I lay next to him after a long day. It wasn't verbal, it wasn't scripted, but it was there, constant, undeniable. And over time, I stopped craving volume. I started listening for the quiet cues, the ones that never lied. He never told me he worried, but I saw it in the way he checked the weather before I drove long distances. In the way he asked, "You sleep okay?" on mornings after I'd had a hard day. He didn't speak his concern, he integrated it into his routine, into his presence. It wasn't a performance, it was just who he was. And maybe that's why it meant more, because it didn't ask to be noticed. It didn't demand recognition. It simply existed, like a background hum of care that never shut off. We live in a world where everyone is constantly narrating their love, but he never did. He never told others what he did for me. Never posted quotes or tagged me in declarations. He was private, not to hide, but to protect. He treated connection like something sacred, not for public display. And while younger me might have resented that, the woman I was becoming saw the strength in it. There's a difference between being someone's proof and being someone's peace. He never tried to prove me. He just gave me peace. There was a kind of gravity to him, a way he held space without needing to fill it. He didn't interrupt my overthinking with rushed comfort. He let me speak, then sat with the silence. That patience, that calm began to reshape me. I started speaking less just to be heard. I started trusting silence as something alive, not empty. His stillness wasn't passive, it was deeply attentive. I began to see that the loudest men in my past had simply drowned out the voice in me that he now gave room to emerge. He never labeled himself a protector, never claimed to be the one who'd always be there. But when life cracked open, when I lost someone, when I broke down, he was the first person who didn't disappear into discomfort. He didn't need to say, "I've got you." He just adjusted his schedule without being asked, picked up groceries without being told, held me without saying the right words, because he knew there were none. And in that silence, I finally heard the truth. The deepest loyalty often says nothing at all. It just shows up. There was a moment I remember clearly, not because of what he said, but because he didn't say anything at all. I had come home tired, overwhelmed, on the edge of unraveling. I expected questions, concern, maybe a push for conversation. Instead, he stood up, handed me a hoodie, and motioned toward the couch. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just made space for me to rest without explanation. That was the moment I realized I no longer needed him to verbalize care. I could feel it without a single word exchanged. I used to analyze everything, every pause in conversation, every short reply, every glance away. I came from love that kept me guessing, so silence used to be a threat. But with him, I began to understand the difference between being ignored and being understood without needing to speak. He didn't withdraw, he simply didn't overstate. There was no manipulation in his quiet. No punishment, just presence. And the more I trusted that, the less I relied on decoding. I stopped needing to interpret. I just started to know. He never said, "I'm proud of you." But I saw it in his eyes when I told him something I'd overcome. He never clapped or cheered, but he made sure I had everything I needed to do the thing I was afraid to try. His love wasn't performative, it was preparational. He didn't praise me to boost my ego. He supported me in ways that strengthened my foundation. And over time, I learned that not hearing the words didn't mean they weren't there. They were simply embedded in his actions over and over. I once told him a long story about my childhood, about the loneliness I had felt growing up, about how often I had to be the strong one. He didn't interrupt. He didn't say, "I understand." When I finished, he didn't offer comfort in words. But the next week, I came home to dinner already made, my favorite movie queued up, and a single sentence, "No strength needed tonight." That was all. And somehow, it was more healing than any dramatic outpouring could have been. He listened, not to reply, but to respond with intention. His silence taught me something my past never could, that love doesn't have to be loud to be secure. He didn't drown me in affection, didn't overwhelm me with daily affirmations. And yet I felt anchored, not by his promises but by his pattern, not by his declarations but by his discipline. I stopped needing to be told I was loved because I stopped questioning it. His presence was steady enough to be felt even in the quiet. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need the words. I had the truth. He never looked me in the eye and said, "I choose you." But he chose me in ways that didn't need a declaration. In how he rearranged his schedule when I needed him. In how he remembered small details I'd forgotten I mentioned. In how he never made me feel like a burden, even when I was messy, emotional, hard to read. There was no grand ceremony in his commitment. No poetic build-up. Just daily decisions that quietly repeated one message: you matter. He didn't speak it. He lived it. There was a time I tested him, not on purpose, but out of habit. I pulled back, created space, waited to see if he'd notice, if he'd close the gap with words. He didn't, not in the way I expected. Instead, he adjusted without panic, gave me space without guilt, checked in without pressure. That response unraveled me, because I realized he didn't chase out of fear. He stayed out of choice, and that kind of quiet loyalty, unshaken by my uncertainty, was louder than any promise ever could be. He never said, "You're safe with me," but I started sleeping better when I was near him. My body stopped bracing for emotional whiplash. There was something in his steadiness that spoke directly to my nervous system. Even when my mind tried to doubt it, he didn't try to earn my trust with declarations. He just never gave me a reason to question it. It was the kind of safety you don't realize you're receiving until you notice what you've stopped fearing. And with him, I stopped fearing inconsistency. Sometimes, in moments of doubt, I wanted to ask, "Do you really love me?" But I never did. Because by then, I knew he wouldn't give me a sentence to soothe me. He would give me a gesture, a small one, the dishes done, a warm drink set beside me, a quiet hand resting on my knee in a room full of people. He didn't talk about love like a feeling. He embodied it like a discipline, a posture, a presence. I didn't need to ask anymore. I could feel it, wordless but undeniable. He wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. No love letters, no over-the-top declarations. But he never let me question my place in his life, not once. I realized that love for him wasn't something to perform. It was something to practice, daily, silently, steadily. And in a world full of people who talk too much and show too little, he did the opposite. He never said, "I'll never leave," but I never had to wonder if he would. Because every quiet act, every simple choice, kept saying what his mouth never had to: "I'm here." He never asked me to mirror him. Never once said, "I do this for you, so you should do it for me." His care didn't come with conditions. His silence wasn't a tactic. He didn't use absence to teach me lessons or presence to make me prove my worth. He simply gave steadily without calculation. And I wasn't used to that. I was used to love that kept a tally. But he wasn't keeping score. He was just being who he was. And in doing so, he taught me that real love doesn't demand, it offers. I remember once forgetting something important to him, a moment I can't even recall now. I braced for the passive-aggressive silence, the cold shoulder I'd received in past relationships. But he said nothing. He didn't punish me with withdrawal. He didn't hold it over my head later. He simply moved on unchanged. And in that quiet grace, I saw what forgiveness without theater looked like. He didn't need an apology to return to love, because he had never left it to begin with. He never said, "You complete me," and thank God for that, because he never needed me to fill a void. His love didn't come from lack, it came from alignment. He wasn't seeking a missing piece. He was sharing a whole. And that wholeness was what made his presence so rare. I didn't feel consumed by him. I didn't feel claimed. I felt witnessed, chosen, not to fix or fulfill, but simply to share a space with someone who didn't need saving. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to earn the air I breathed in someone else's life. There's a kind of love that needs to be seen to exist. Then there's the kind that exists whether it's seen or not. His was the second kind. I know this because he kept showing up even when I was difficult to be around. Even when I doubted him, when I questioned his silence, when I asked for reassurance he didn't know how to give. He didn't leave. He didn't retreat. He stayed, not because I made it easy, but because that's just who he was, unshaken, undeterred, unspoken but undeniable. What made his love so quietly powerful was that it never asked for applause. He didn't want to be thanked for being decent. He didn't expect credit for being consistent. He never made his presence feel like a favor, and the more I noticed that, the more I realized how rare it was. We live in a world where love is often currency, something we trade, negotiate, withhold. But not him. He never withheld, never negotiated, he just gave. And because of that, I started to give differently too, not for validation, but for truth. There were nights when I felt fragile for no clear reason. Moments where my emotions surfaced uninvited, raw and unexplained. I wouldn't ask for comfort, but somehow he always knew. He didn't ask, "What's wrong?" He didn't try to pull words out of me. He'd just sit close, offer warmth, sometimes say nothing at all. It wasn't indifference, it was precision. His presence wasn't loud or dramatic, but it always landed exactly where I needed it. He didn't say, "I'm here for you." He just was. I've been with men who told me they loved me 10 different ways and broke every version of that sentence. But he didn't say it until long after I stopped needing to hear it. And when he did, it wasn't in candlelight or crisis, it was in passing, quiet, natural, like it had always been true and just waited until the moment fit. I didn't cry when he said it, I didn't melt, because by then I had already felt it 100 times, in his actions, his stillness, his quiet consistency. The words just confirmed what I already knew. There's something holy about a person who never uses love as leverage, who doesn't dangle attention like a reward or pull it back as punishment. I tested him without realizing it, with distance, with silence, with uncertainty, and every time he remained steady, present, patient, not trying to convince me to stay, not trying to prove his worth, just offering his truth again and again without asking for mine on a deadline. That kind of love doesn't need strategy. It only needs truth. He didn't ask for reassurance either. Never once said, "Do you still care about me?" or "Am I doing enough?" He didn't need constant feedback to feel anchored. His sense of self wasn't tied to my reaction. And because of that, I found myself relaxing around him in a way I never had before. I didn't need to manage his emotions. I didn't need to translate mine. There was space for honesty, for imperfection, for silence. In a world full of people who need to be seen constantly, his quiet confidence was a refuge. That's the thing about him. He didn't announce his love. He embodied it. He didn't spell it out. He made it unmistakable. And that's why I stayed. Not because he made me promises, not because he swept me into a fantasy, but because every day, in small, almost invisible ways, he made love feel like a place I didn't have to fight to exist in. No explanation needed, no performance required. Just a steady, wordless understanding. I see you, I respect you, I'm still here. There was a point where I caught myself trying to fill the silence, talking just to be heard, asking questions just to feel closer. But he never responded out of obligation. He listened fully, then answered only when there was something worth saying. At first, I mistook that for detachment. But over time, I understood he wasn't ignoring me. He was filtering out the noise, choosing intention over reaction. And it made me reflect. Was I speaking because I needed to? Or because I was afraid of what would surface if I didn't? I started noticing how often I used words to seek validation, how often I wrapped insecurity in conversation. But with him, I didn't need to convince or narrate. He wasn't moved by volume. He was moved by truth, so I began slowing down, speaking less, listening more, not because I was silenced, but because I finally had space to hear myself. His calm didn't demand quiet, it invited it. And that kind of space, the kind that doesn't rush you to fill it, is where real understanding begins. He never competed for air in the room, never raised his voice to win a moment. And the more I softened into that dynamic, the more I realized I had spent years mistaking performance for communication. But this wasn't performance. This was something quieter, deeper. A kind of exchange where energy mattered more than expression, where tone mattered more than timing, where presence meant more than any perfect phrase. He taught me that not everything needs to be said. Some things are better felt and trusted. One night, after a long pause in our conversation, I looked at him and asked, "Why don't you say more?" He didn't flinch. He just said, "Because I don't want to waste your attention." That landed hard, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. He wasn't withholding. He was protecting what he said, so when it came, it had weight. And from that point on, I stopped waiting for more. I started valuing the enough that was already there. His restraint wasn't distance, it was respect. I realized slowly that I didn't need constant dialogue to feel connected. With him, I could sit in silence and still feel chosen. I could cry without having to explain. I could laugh without needing to be funny. I could be without trying to be anything more. That kind of space, free from performance, free from demand, is rare. And in it, I discovered a version of myself I didn't know existed, softer, slower, less afraid. His silence didn't quiet me. It invited me to finally hear my own voice, clearly, calmly, truthfully. Loving him wasn't like anything I'd known before. It required learning a new language, one without guarantees, without constant affirmations. A language of subtle gestures, of steady patterns, of presence without pressure. At first, I fumbled through it. I wanted subtitles. I wanted confirmations. But he never changed his way of being just to ease my discomfort. And maybe that's why I eventually trusted him. Because he didn't adjust himself to win me. He waited for me to grow into a version of myself that didn't need winning. I started recognizing things I'd missed. The way he always faced me when I spoke, even if I was rambling. The way he remembered the things I'd said only once. The way his goodbye never came with "I'll miss you," but his return always came with the same warmth, the same presence. He didn't build expectation. He built reliability. And I realized he had been loving me all along, just not in the language I was used to. Not through noise, but through nuance. Not through promises, but through patterns. There's a quiet kind of intimacy that doesn't ask to be validated. It just exists. And once I stopped trying to label it, I could feel it everywhere. In the way he adjusted the passenger seat before I got in. In the way he noticed when I was overstimulated and offered calm without question. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were part of his design. He didn't say "I see you," but I'd never felt more visible. And it made me wonder, how much love had I missed in my life because it didn't come wrapped in words? One afternoon, as we sat quietly reading in the same room, I looked up and watched him, not doing anything special, just existing. And I realized this is what safety feels like, not being constantly reassured, not being flattered, but being allowed to take up space without needing to be interesting. His love didn't chase attention, it didn't seek approval, it just was. And slowly, my nervous system learned that this was okay, that I didn't need to perform or explain, that I could just be and still be loved. The longer I stayed, the more fluent I became in his way of loving. I stopped needing the sentences I once thought were essential. "I miss you. You matter. You're mine," because I felt those things in how he checked the oil in my car, in how he saved the last slice for me, in how he never interrupted me when I spoke, no matter how tired he was. His love didn't announce itself, it embedded itself, quietly, consistently. And all I had to do was stop translating and start receiving. I used to believe love had to be proved to be real, that it had to come with grand gestures, emotional declarations, a sense of urgency. But he taught me something entirely different. Love doesn't need to be proved when it's practiced daily. He didn't try to impress me. He wasn't driven by insecurity or the need to be chosen. He simply showed up on time, prepared, present. He never tried to convince me of his heart. He just gave it, piece by piece, without needing to be applauded for doing so. His way of loving made me uncomfortable at first, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't match what I'd been taught to expect. I had come to equate effort with drama, expression with excess, but his effort was clean, quiet, precise. He didn't talk about what he would do, he just did it. He didn't tell me I was safe, he created safety through consistency. And the more I let go of needing proof, the more I realized the proof had been there all along, just not in the form I thought I needed. What made his love different was that it asked for nothing, not attention, not reassurance, not reciprocation. He wasn't keeping score, he wasn't loving to be loved back. He loved from alignment, from clarity. And I had never seen that before. I had seen love used as currency, as performance, as control. But his love never shifted with my mood. It didn't shrink when I was distant. It didn't inflate when I praised him. It remained exactly what it had always been, sincere, self-contained. There were days I expected him to crack, to react, to explode, to demand something from me emotionally. But he never did. He responded, always, with grace, even when I was impatient, even when I poked for validation. And in that lack of reaction, I found something I never anticipated: trust. I didn't trust him because he promised not to leave. I trusted him because I saw who he was when I gave him every reason to flinch, and he didn't. He never used my doubt against me. He just gave me space until I didn't need it anymore. I stopped waiting for the perfect words, because I realized his love wasn't in what he said. It was in what he chose not to say. He never used silence as a weapon, never made me guess where I stood. He didn't over-explain, but he never withheld. He offered presence instead of poetry, decisions instead of declarations. And somehow that became more romantic than anything else ever had. I stopped needing him to spell it out. I already knew the story. I was living in the truth of it, one quiet act at a time. He never said, "I'm not going anywhere." But he never disappeared, not when I pulled away, not when I got quiet, not when I doubted myself. He remained quiet, patient, open. There was no grand declaration of loyalty, just the simple, unwavering act of being there, every day, every mood, every shift in me that would have scared off someone less rooted. And over time, I stopped needing the words, because his actions weren't trying to convince me. They were just revealing the truth. He was already choosing me, silently, every single time. He never said, "You're beautiful," but when I walked into the room, I always felt seen. Not for how I looked, but for how I showed up. He didn't compliment for the sake of ease or flattery, but he noticed. He noticed the way I wore my emotions on my face. He noticed when I tucked my hands into my sleeves out of nervousness. He never named those things out loud, but his energy always shifted toward them. And I realized sometimes what goes unsaid isn't forgotten. It's simply understood on a level deeper than language. He never said, "You inspire me," but I could see it in the way he listened when I spoke about things that lit me up. He asked thoughtful questions. He encouraged without pushing. And when I achieved something, he didn't make a show of celebration. He just gave me a glance that said, "Of course you did," as if my success was not a surprise, but an inevitability he already believed in. I never needed to ask if he believed in me. I just had to watch how he stayed close to my fire, never trying to dim it or claim it. He never said, "You hurt me," but I knew when I did, not through punishment or distance, but through the quiet shift in his eyes, the way he took a deeper breath before responding, the pause in his rhythm. He didn't make pain theatrical, he made it teachable. He never weaponized his emotions. He simply felt them and moved with them, not against me. And that made me want to be more careful with my words. Not out of fear, but out of respect, because he showed me that strength can coexist with vulnerability. He never said, "This means everything to me," but I saw it in how he protected our time, in how he remembered the things that mattered to me, in how he kept showing up, not because it was expected, but because it was honest. His devotion didn't need to be announced. It was lived. I used to believe love needed to be voiced constantly to be real, but he showed me a quieter truth. The most sacred things are often the most silent, and sometimes what isn't said is the very thing that makes love unshakable. He never said, "You changed me," but I saw it in the way he softened over time, not because I asked him to, not because I demanded more, but because I met him with patience, with space, just as he had always met me. There was no dramatic arc, no sudden shift. Just small adjustments, quieter tension, longer pauses, a hand that reached back for mine a little sooner. I didn't need him to tell me I mattered. I saw it in the ways he made room for me, without ever having to be asked. He never said, "I'm glad you stayed." But every morning, when he poured my coffee first or tucked the blanket back over my legs before getting up, I felt it. He didn't speak affection the way others did, but he made me feel safe without promises, valued without praise. He never made me guess, because everything he did was clear, even in silence. And I realized maybe love isn't always about knowing the words, it's about trusting the feeling that's been there all along, waiting for you to finally stop doubting it. He never said, "I'm yours," but he never gave himself to anyone else, not with time, not with energy, not with presence. He didn't need boundaries reinforced. He didn't flirt with chaos or entertain attention just to test what he had. He chose peace, and he chose me within that peace. Not as a performance, not as a possession, but as a quiet alignment. It was in the way he planned a future without asking if I'd be in it, because he knew I'd already chosen it with him. In the way I'd stopped needing loud love to feel real. He never said, "This is love," but everything about him, his charisma, his consistency, taught me that it was. Not the kind of love I grew up romanticizing. Not the kind that dances in grand gestures, but the kind that plants itself, grows slowly, holds its shape even in silence. And in that still, subtle love, I found a reflection of the woman I had always hoped to become, less reactive, more attuned, less afraid, more certain. I didn't need him to define love. I was living inside it every day we shared. So, no, he didn't say the things I once begged to hear. He never handed me those rehearsed lines, never wrapped his feelings in declarations. But I know now he didn't have to. Because real love doesn't shout. It shows up, it stays, it chooses you without noise. And the man who said the least taught me the most. He showed me that some of the truest things aren't spoken. They're felt, honored, lived, and because of him, I no longer measure love by what is said, but by what is never in question.